Welcome, greetings all. I am, of course, Dr. Gentleman, and today it's Halloween, so we are talking about Bram Stoker's Dracula. It is time for great works. Welcome to my house. What is a man? Just a miserable little pile of secrets. One secret, Two secrets, Yes, it is Halloween, so we are going to discuss a book about vampires. It's an incredibly original idea that no other YouTuber has ever thought of, okay? Nobody looks at Thug Notes, alright? I feel like this channel's starting to get there. I'm getting happier with the look of the videos, and look, we've even got a blurry background. I think it's okay to have 3 longer videos at the start to help with the algorithm, and hopefully people go back and watch them in the future when there's more than 4 of you out there watching this. But I've really got to start making my scripts shorter. It's just, it's hard for me. I have a lot to say. Okay, today's question, one question only, and let's hope it's a spooky one. How do you say Worcestershire sauce? Like that, Worcestershire sauce. And you know what? Yeah, I get it. I mean, some British people love to mock Americans for not knowing how to say this word and similar ones.
Oh, you want to go to Leicester Square, do you?
But yeah, it really does look like it could be pronounced another way, like Worcestershire. But I can explain. There are 3 syllables to Worcestershire, and all have been kind of squashed down from what's written. That's pretty common for English place names, many of which, predate the rules of spelling. And the first syllable is worse. Now this probably started out more like a warse, similar to force, but as people kept saying it and they got a little bit lazy, it became just wuss. The second is stir, which gets squashed down to stir. It's exactly the same as the word gangster. And shire is a common suffix for a county in England, which is basically an area. It's often named after the most important city there, so you have Yorkshire, Cambridgeshire, Oxfordshire.
Hey, but that sounds different from Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, I know. On its own, it's shire, but at the end of the word, it's shire. And I'm a little confused when American people find that weird, because, well, what's this state called? It's not New Hampshire. The only thing that's really confusing about the 3 syllables of Worcestershire is how the first 2 link together. First Worc, then stir. And the end of Worc and the beginning of stir kind of blend together. Worcester. That's why the spelling is confusing. The CES looks like it should be said as a syllable. Worcester. But actually it's just the end of one syllable and the start of another, which is the same sound. That gives us the city name, Worcester, and its county, Worcestershire. Okay, I just said that I wanted to make my video shorter, and I go deep on Worcestershire sauce. Let's go back to Bram Stoker and the terrifying story of the vampires. If you want to quake in fear, if you want your teeth to chatter and your knees to knock, if you want to regret your choice of wearing those light-colored chinos today, maybe Dracula isn't for you. Compared with the horror stories it was derived from, compared with old folk stories from around the world, even compared with contemporary horror, this book just isn't that scary. You kiddies who grew up reading Slender Man stories when you were still in your single digits, you're not even going to feel a shiver down your spine. That's the honest truth. It's what's called an epistolary novel, which means that the story is told not as a conventional narrative, but through a series of materials that might have been written down in real life, like mostly letters, but also diary entries and news clippings, that kind of thing. You might think that gives it a touch of realism, like the Victorian equivalent of the Blair Witch Project. But actually, these, terrible, scary stories are being written by people who have sat down to do their journal entry later on. That gives this real distance between the reader and the action that I just don't think works for horror. But there's a bigger problem. A great big plot-related problem, and that's that the big scary Dracula actually does very little in this story. A large chunk of the plot is devoted to dealing with these boxes full of dirt that Dracula can rest in, and then chasing after the last box which has Dracula inside. Then, spoiler warning, they just kill him in his sleep. If you think about the plot from the point of view of Dracula himself, he basically, spooks his real estate solicitor, Jonathan Harker, and leaves him to the mercy of the three vampire sisters in his castle. Then goes to England, turns one girl into a vampire and kills her mother as a kind of afterthought. And then goes for Jonathan Harker's fiancée Mina. He then realizes he's being hunted, kills one mentally unwell guy, and spends the remainder of the novel running away and hiding in boxes of dirt. For me, it's an extremely weak final act, especially with more of a scuffle than a final confrontation at the end. Vampire expert Van Helsing raiding the castle works well to build tension, and then there's a kind of feeling of a race against time as the sun is going to set. But then, In the final battle, one ally called Quincy Morris does get fatally stabbed by a minion, but ultimately it all winds up with all the fun and excitement that you might expect from a fight where a bunch of men with guns jump out to confront some completely uncharacterized gypsies who have knives, all fighting over a box of dirt with an old comatose vampire inside. The point, of course, is that the consequences of his actions occupy the main characters for most of the length of the book. First, Mina's friend Lucy is the monster's victim, and, Van Helsing is brought in for his expertise, but then people keep screwing up his anti-vampire measures. So, in the end, it's too late to save Lucy, and they have to catch her, stab her through the heart, cut off her head, and, stuff her mouth full of garlic. This is the grisly stuff that those Victorians loved. Then the same is going to happen to Mina, unless they can find and destroy Dracula himself. The bulk of the action here is really about the male character's anxieties and protective urges when it comes to the women. The three vampire sisters are wanton, unpredictable, dangerous monsters beyond the control of any normal man. Lucy is a woman who cannot be protected, especially if the authority figure who knows how to save her keeps being disobeyed. But there is hope for Mina, who has the protection of the men around her. As she writes in her journal, the world seems full of good men, even if there are monsters in it. Everything in this novel revolves around authority and control, and the sheer terror that can set in when you realize that somebody else has a greater level of control than you do. You don't get much more Victorian than that. The author, Bram Stoker, was a very Irish sort of an Irishman. If he were alive today, he'd probably make way too many Happy Wheels videos. He was born in 1847 in Dublin, studied in Trinity College there, and worked for a while as a theatre critic before his friendship with the great actor Henry Irving allowed him access to high society in London. He had an interesting hot and cold relationship with the other Irish writer very popular in London society at the time, Oscar Fingal O'Flaherty Wills Wilde. Dracula was written shortly after Wilde was imprisoned for his homosexual lifestyle, and it's sometimes observed that Stoker's particular iteration of the refined, aristocratic, but despised vampire is in some way a reflection of Victorian attitudes to homosexuality, or possibly even to his own inner struggles with his conceptions of his confused sexuality. But that's just one reading that you might not agree with. He was a respected writer, and Dracula was his 6th novel, but it's the only one of his books that I've ever read, and I'm not sure that many people can say differently. Stoker's major sources are pretty common knowledge at this point. The name Dracula comes from historical nobility around the area of Transylvania, including Vlad the Impaler. His conception of a vampire owes a lot to Romanian tradition, primarily derived from an article called Transylvanian Superstition by Emily Gerard, which was published in the intellectual magazine the 19th century. And vampire stories don't start with Dracula. They'd been popular in England since the short story The Vampire was published in 1819. It was initially attributed to Lord Byron, which absolutely helped its early popularity, but it was actually written by Dr. John William Polidori, who was Byron's personal physician, and also the uncle of the painter Dante Gabriel Rossetti. Polidori's story, that's super fun to say, Polidori's story was built up from a basic idea from Byron, and it was the origin of our conception of the sophisticated, aristocratic vampire. And given that the vampire figure is basically Polidori's idea of what Lord Byron is like, there's a pretty strong argument to be made that all the versions of the aristocratic, refined, elegant vampire we've had since, essentially versions of Lord Byron. And yes, Polidori was there on the night that Byron and the Shelleys read the Phantasmagoriana, which also led to the creation of Frankenstein. By the time Dracula was published, you could say that Europe already had a vampire craze. Le Fanu had already written Carmilla, and no less a literary figure than Tolstoy saw his work in print for the first time with a novella called The Vampire. And in my opinion, the greatest vampire story ever told, even if it's not explicitly a vampire story, had already been written in France and serialized between 1844 and 1845. Alexandre Dumas' The Count of Monte Cristo. There may not be blood-sucking in it, but Dantes has a lot of the classic vampire about him, and Dumas was sure to put in a nod to Polidori. For all the unkind things I've said about this book, though, there is no denying its accomplishments. Stoker was an experienced and celebrated writer, and even if the book isn't poetry through and through, there are some really beautiful moments. And Stoker uses his characters to muse on a lot of wider themes. My favourite quote from the book comes from the diary of Dr. Seward, who's one of Lucy's suitors. He says, "It is the fault of our science that it wants to explain all, and if it explain not, then it says there is nothing to explain." And most importantly, Count Dracula managed to have a cultural resonance far beyond any other figure from Gothic horror. So much of the modern vampire story coalesces here, like the blood on the neck of the beautiful young damsel. And every vampire story since is influenced in some way by Stoker's imagery. The iconography is just superb. You know, the vampire leaving 2 bite marks on the neck of the victim after sucking their blood. Shape-shifting into mist or a bat, showing weakness only to symbols of Christianity and garlic and, to an extent, sunlight. And, of course, getting stabbed through the heart, but, well, I guess that's not just vampires. He has no reflection and no shadow. He can climb the walls and hypnotize with a look. And he is lord of the vampires, controlling those that he turned and being able to communicate with them telepathically. You probably know all of these powers intuitively, having seen vampire archetypes again and again and again. That's the power this book has, codifying those ideas and making them nearly universally recognized, far beyond any of the memes that this century has produced. Vampire stories have become a whole subgenre, as well as looming large in the history of cinema. And some part of Dracula is always there, whether you're watching Twilight or Hotel Transylvania. Which I'd put on about the same level of sophistication, by the way. Which doesn't mean I hate either of them. No, not at all. That level of cultural influence is nothing short of phenomenal. While teenaged me was pretty disappointed with the story and the lack of thrills, you know, and certainly I think it could have been written better. Its cultural influence, Stoker's grasp on iconic imagery, and the peerless level of influence it has exerted over all stories that seek to frighten the reader make me completely unashamed to call Dracula another great work. Okay, that's all for today. This should be a shorter video. This is the kind of length I'm going to aim for from now on. I think it's time to mix things up, so I'll probably choose something that's not a novel for the next video. And I think it's probably time to have some women writers in the series too. But this one had to be done for Halloween, and I hope it was spoopy enough for you. That's all for today. Please do all the usual YouTube stuff and send me any questions. My email address is in the description. Until then, farewell, my children. Farewell.